Hello, everybody, and welcome to TimeXtender Tuesdays. It is Tuesday, December 7, 2021, and today we're going to be talking about implementing self-lookups in TimeXtender. Now, when talking about self-lookups, it's important to understand the concepts that how you would handle this in a traditional relational database. Now, in a traditional relational database, you handle self-lookups or self-joins by joining the table to itself, using one of the other IDs in the table to pull values from itself and essentially rearrange values based on a certain join within its own table. That's why these are also known as self-joins. So when doing this, of course, in a relational database, you're going to use a script to script all of this out. Now in TimeXtender, you have a table and you create joins or lookups by dragging from one table to another. But when you only have one table, this can be a little bit confusing on how you create this self-join or self-lookup within TimeXtender. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. Before we get into that, we're going to talk about quite a few different examples of where you see these in the real world. So first, I want to talk about relational databases. Now, in their nature, relational databases are somewhat hierarchical, right? So when we're talking about these different hierarchies and bringing data together, I'd like to reference some of our previous episodes. So 2 episodes ago, episode 16, we talked about denormalization, right? And that's bringing values from one other table into another table, bringing that data together, right? And then in our last episode, we talked about many-to-many relationships, how a table can relate to many other values in another table and vice versa to the table back. So it's important, if you haven't looked at these previous videos, you should go and take a look at these previous videos, especially episode 16, to understand denormalization between other tables before we start looking at doing self-lookups between us inside of a single table. So what are some real-world examples of why you would want to create a self-lookup? One example is if you're looking at parts or items in a database, you have different items or parts or products in a database. It may be that one part consists of many other parts, right? And the only reason these subparts even exist is to build this larger part. And that would be known as a sub-assembly. So if you're looking at a product list, and in that product list, it says, parent assembly or assembly ID or something like that, you'll know that that part exists to create this larger part. And that's what's known, you can consider this a hierarchy, right? You have a parent item, and then that parent item has its different children items. So you may want to look up the name of this parent item, right? Let's say you have a cog, right? Cog, in a wheel. So you have a cog, but this cog is specifically designed to create this one larger part. So you may want to look up the name of what that larger part is, so you understand that from within the table itself. It's just easier to find information if it all exists in the same table. Now, another great example of this, a more common example, is an organizational hierarchy. And this is the example we're going to be looking at today. We're going to look at some data, understand in an organizational hierarchy, you may have a boss or a manager, and you may want to know at the employee level who is the manager of this individual. So let's see what that'll look like. So we have an organization here. I guess you may be able to guess the name of this organization. We have employee IDs here on the left. We have an employee name column here in the middle. And then we have a manager ID. So we can see that these employees, Mickey Mouse, Minnie Mouse, and Donald Duck, have a manager ID of number 1. So this is actually going to be looking back to the employee ID of 1 right here. So we know that the manager of these 3 individuals is this individual right here, Walt Disney. Okay, so we'll be able to say that if we wanted to do a self lookup, let's say instead of having to guess what they are or do some other interesting work, we just wanted to see this manager's name right here in the table. Well, we could do a self lookup or a self join and pull that information in. And this is what a self lookup would do in TimeXtender. So let's go ahead and get underway. What are you going to need to be able to follow through these exercises with me today? First and foremost, you are going to need, of course, TimeXtender. TimeXtender app server implementation, of course, that's going to include the TimeXtender software, SQL Server, or an Azure SQL database or something like that. We don't need anything else tricky. We don't need a data lake or analysis services or Power BI in this case. We're purely just going to be doing this in the database itself. If you want to know what data set I'm working with today, you can find this data set here at this URL. We'll try to include this URL in the description of the video below, but take a look at this URL. You can find the employee table, which is the table that I'm going to be working with, the data set I'm going to be working with today. So let's take a look at these implementation steps. I'll refer back to these steps as we go through the exercise, but let's take a look. First, we want to identify the data, then we'll create a custom view of this table. We want to make sure we use the transformation view variant when we take a look at that. We're going to deploy the view, read the view fields, we're going to create a relation, and then create a lookup from that view back to the original table. So essentially, this is looking back to the original table. It's a self lookup. We're just doing so by creating a view and then looking up data from that view. So let's walk through how we do this in TimeXtender. Let me open up TimeXtender, and here you can see in this tab I have the MDW. I can go ahead and close this because I'm not going to need it in this exercise. So here I have an employee table. So we have employees here. As I mentioned before, take a look at that data set. You'll be able to pull this in and walk through this exercise yourself if you want. But in this table, let's go ahead and preview it and see what I have. So I have an employee ID, first name, last name, email, phone number, hire date, and then of course our manager ID, which is what we were looking at before. So we want to pull, let's say for example, these two employees, we want to be able to pull the manager or the employee of 100, Stephen King, right here so we can see who their manager is without having to look back at other lines in the table. So let's go ahead and walk through that. The first thing we want to do is let's go ahead and, to make it easier on ourselves, let's get the employee's name in one single field. So we'll call it employee full name. So I'm going to add a field. I'm going to call this full name. Increase the text length here to 150 and click OK. Then I can add a transformation. Go to field transformations here and add. I'll just pull in first name, plus, add a space, another plus, and then of course last name. So we're just going to concatenate first name and last name with a space right in between. We'll click OK, and then I have first name and last name concatenated right there. The nice thing, as many of you may know already, but if I go in and change one of the names of these fields, TimeXtender will automatically update my script to ensure that it continues to work. And that's what these parameters here are for. Anytime you're writing custom script in TimeXtender, you're going to want to make sure you're using these parameters whenever possible. So I'll click OK, and then I have my employee full name right there. The next step is I need to take my table and then create a custom view of that table. Really easy way to do that is simply drag the table right on top of views and then create a name. And I'm going to call this manager self lookup because we're going to be using this view for the manager self lookup. Now for creating self lookups, you only need the fields that are necessary for the lookup. So we're going to be looking up full name. We're going to need the employee ID, and that's all we need for this exercise. So we can actually get rid of all the other fields. Feel free to keep them if you want, but you don't necessarily have to. It'll just add some additional fields in there, some confusion. It is a view, so it's not going to be adding any extra data. So again, feel free to keep them there if you want. Now, the most important thing here, and let's jump back to our implementation steps. So we're creating our custom view, and we want to use the transformation view variant. This is very important because by default, when we're doing this, TimeXtender is going to try and pull the valid table variant. All right, so let's take a look here. If you can see here, it's employees. It's creating a parameter of that employees table. You can see here DBO employees, and it's using the valid table. Now, for this step, that data, when it's processing this lookup in this step of the execution procedure, right? If you think of the execution order of operations, right? TimeXtender fully loads the the raw table, and then you have the transformation view that's on top of the raw table, and then the stored procedure handles the lookups, looking up from the raw table and inserts that data into the valid table. It's actually inserting the data back into the raw table. But at this point in time in the execution process, this data does not yet exist in the valid table. So we need to look earlier on in the process. Now we could do the raw table in this case. However, we are doing a transformation. Full name, as you remember, we concatenated full name and last name. So we're doing a transformation. This data is not even going to exist in the raw table either. So in this case, we have to select the transformation view. Very important here. So pick the transformation view there. Okay. So you'll get this message. It contains some unused parameters. This is just telling us that our view script now contains parameters that we remove. We remove the fields that were being referred to by these different parameters. And you say, yeah, you can go ahead and remove them. We're not using them anymore. That's fine. The next steps, we need to deploy the view and then read the view fields. So let's go ahead and do that. Expand our views here. We have our manager self-lookup view. Let's go ahead and hit deploy. Hit start. And this is going to ask us if we... Oh, and that, of course, failed because I didn't deploy the table either. I need to deploy both of these. So what I'm going to do here is go to MDW, deploy. I will simply deploy and modify tables and views. So this is going to select anything red in my MDW, and it's going to deploy those objects. So I'm going to deploy the table and then the lookup. This will take just a second here. TimeXtender is writing all of the alter table scripts, create table scripts, create view scripts necessary for creating a new field here in the table, and then of course creating my view. Now it's saving the project, so it's just updating the project repository with this new metadata as well. So we'll be able to have all of that new data available in our project repository. So now we have here our manager self-lookup. So once we've deployed the view, it's important that we read view fields, because right now our view doesn't have any fields on it. We can't expand here. We don't have any fields yet. So to see the fields, we have to click read view fields. TimeXtender then looks at the view script and generates actual fields here based on what was available in the view script. So let's go ahead and open that in a new window. The next step here is to create a relation from the view to the table. And the following that step, of course, is to finally create the lookup. So we're going to create a relation from the view to the table. We could go employee ID to employee ID, but that's not really what we want here. What we want to do is do employee ID to manager ID. So we simply drag and drop to create that relationship. Remember, we want to pull in the manager ID, manager name, right, from here. So we'll click yes to create the relation, and then we've created that relation from employee ID to manager ID, and then we can bring in full name. So let me just drag in full name right here. We'll click OK to use the relation as the join, and then we want to, of course, rename this to manager name, because, of course, our join is employee ID to manager ID. So we're actually pulling the manager and not the employee's name. So now I've created my self-lookup. Now the final step for me here is simply to deploy and execute this table. Click Start, and of course, TimeXtender will deploy those scripts, update those scripts as necessary, and then execute all of that data. So we'll see here in just a second. TimeXtender will reload this. It'll run the stored procedure. Of course, that stored procedure is what's handling the lookups. That stored procedure is looking at the view, which of course is looking at the transformation view, which is pulling that concatenated first name and last name back into the table based on that employee ID is equal to manager ID relationship. So now let's preview our table here and we'll see if we have the manager name, and we do. So yes, so we have employee full name right here, and then of course the manager of that individual, Nina, the manager is Stephen King. And so you can see going through here, we have everyone's manager's name directly right on that level. Makes it really easy to see. If you have a lot of people, a lot of data consumers querying the database, this might be really nice for them to have. There are also a number of different other data problems that you can solve by doing these self-lookups, having this data just within the table. Now that is self-lookups. So thank you so much for watching. If you're interested in more content, please take a look at our YouTube channel. You can subscribe. We do have an exclusive channel just for TimeXtender Tuesdays. So if you like this kind of content, go ahead and subscribe. You'll get notifications whenever there are new videos coming in, and you can stay up to date with everything new on TimeXtender. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye.